Welcome to Women Who Kick Glass, the podcast that dives into the fearless women who changed history and the fights that are still shaping our world today. From suffragists to civil rights activists, these women refuse to back down, breaking barriers and demanding change. And now, here's your host, an advocate, a storyteller, and a woman who kicks glass herself, Ann Potenza.
Okay, let me ask you a question. You're a United States citizen, you're over 18, you want to vote in the presidential election, you do, and you get arrested and jailed for that vote. How would that make you feel? What would you do after that? Because that's what happened to Susan B. Anthony. She believed so strongly in everyone's right to vote that she took that chance and she suffered the consequences. And it didn't stop her from continuing to pursue what became the 19th Amendment. And the reason why you are able to vote in elections nowadays. Does that help make you realize how important the vote is when someone was willing to do that for us to vote? Susan B. Anthony was born in 1820, way before we got the right to vote. She grew up in Massachusetts when the Industrial Revolution was just starting to cross America, and cotton cloth was in high demand at this time. So Susan's father actually started his own cotton factory and employed many young women to work in the factory, and some of them lived with them as well. Even at an early age, Susan wondered why her father never employed a woman to be an overseer in the factory. He was very concerned with the westward expansion of slavery, and she often heard him mention that he tried to avoid purchasing cotton that was raised by enslaved labor. This early understanding of the horrors of slavery stayed with Susan throughout her whole life. A few weeks after her 13th birthday, Susan became a member of the Society of Friends, which was part of the Quaker religion. One of their main values is the equality of all people before God. So the Quakers not only encouraged but demanded education for both boys and girls. And as soon as Susan was old enough, she worked and taught homeschool to the younger children during the summer. When she was 15, Susan's father sent her to the Friends Academy near Philadelphia, where she studied a variety of subjects: arithmetic, algebra, chemistry, literature, philosophy, physiology, astronomy, and bookkeeping. When Susan was in her 20s, her family moved to Rochester, New York, and they became very active in the anti-slavery movement. Every Sunday, they hosted anti-slavery meetings in their home, and many famous abolitionists like Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison would come to their home for these meetings. She spent about a decade working side by side with a lot of these abolitionists, and when she was in her mid-30s, she was invited to go on an anti-slavery lecture circuit, and this was during a major period that defined U.S. history. It was the decade right before the Civil War broke out. During this time, Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin, the new fugitive state law was passed, and the pending Kansas-Nebraska Act was infuriating Northerners and abolitionists. Susan spoke out against slavery wherever she could find an audience. She even challenged Abraham Lincoln when he only had a moderate position on slavery in 1861. She demanded no compromises with slaveholders. It was a chapter in her life that she would later call the Winter of Mobs. It was so bad that a mob in Syracuse, New York, burned her in effigy and dragged her body throughout the streets. 2 years later, Susan, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone formed the Women's Loyal National League to press for a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery. And this goal was finally realized with the passage of the 13th Amendment in 1865. It was after the 13th Amendment passed that they really started working on the right to vote. But before we get into that, we have to backtrack to her 20s when Susan was a teacher in New York. Becoming a part of the teachers union, she soon realized that the male teachers were making $10 a month and the female teachers were only making $2.50 a month. It was her work with the teachers union as well as her work with the abolitionists that really set her on the path for women's suffrage. As it so happened, Susan was attending a Sons of Temperance state convention, but was told to sit down and listen and learn, which went against her Quaker upbringing. So she immediately turned to the women's suffrage movement and attended her first women's rights convention after that. Although Susan wasn't part of the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, New York, it was the next year when she met Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and as a result, Susan's work started with circulating petitions for married women's property rights and women's suffrage. And even with that, she's refused permission to speak at the Capitol or at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So instead, she begins a New York State campaign for women's suffrage and starts lecturing and traveling alone. After the Civil War, suffragists had 4 major legal strategies: campaigning at the federal and state level, lobbying to supportive voters and their casting of ballots, proposing a new women's suffrage constitutional amendment, and litigating in court to test women's rights under the existing 14th and 15th Amendment. Unfortunately, it was at the point of ratification of the 14th and 15th Amendment that the suffrage movement started to split. The 14th Amendment was the first mention of gender in the Constitution because it granted all male citizens of 21 years and older the right to vote. The 15th Amendment stated that the right to vote would not be denied due to race. Susan and other suffragists that sided with her only supported the 15th Amendment if it granted universal suffrage to all, regardless of race or gender. Then there were activists like Lucy Stone and Frederick Douglass who supported the amendment because they thought it would be impossible to get voting for both Black men and women at the same time. Though Susan lobbied for the abolishment of slavery and enslaved African Americans, she still sided with the racist positions of women's suffrage over the 14th and 15th Amendment getting passed first. So it was because of the difference of opinion among the women's suffragists that the movement splintered. And Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton started the National Women's Suffrage Association, which opposed the 15th Amendment unless it included the women's right to vote. And Lucy Stone and her suffragists that agreed with her started the American Women's Suffrage Association. So both of these groups were vying against each other for support for their organizations. And it was only when the 15th Amendment was ratified in 1870 that these two opposing suffrage organizations finally came together for the same cause again, which was in securing an amendment for the women's right to vote. To focus attention on women's suffrage and in reaction to women being excluded from the 15th Amendment, Susan called together the first suffrage convention in Washington, D.C. in 1869. And it was a few months later that the first federal women's suffrage amendment was proposed in Congress for consideration. It was throughout the presidential campaign of 1872 that Susan preached to women to claim their rights by urging them to register to vote in every state in the Union under the 14th and 15th Amendment, even though it didn't technically include them in this right to vote. Leading by example, during this presidential campaign, Susan, her sister, and a Quaker friend walked into a local barber shop and registered to vote. 11 other women joined them as they boldly entered the barber shop and bewildered the male registrars who allowed them to sign in and register. And 2 weeks later, she was arrested at her home in Rochester, New York, by a U.S. Marshal and was put on trial at the Ontario County Courthouse. Susan and her female colleagues brought up on trial all pleaded not guilty, and bail was set. This gave Susan 3 weeks to travel around the country and give lectures on the crime of an American citizen voting in an election. And because she got around, the prosecutor complained and they moved the trial to another county. On June 17, 1873, Susan was put on trial by a jury of 12 white men. and the judge made a decision before the trial even started that they should declare her guilty. Susan was forbidden to even defend herself until after the verdict, until after she was convicted and fined $100, which she refused to pay. But the judge purposely did not give her jail time, which ended her opportunity to appeal her case. You see, Susan was hoping that an appeal would make its way up to the Supreme Court. Although her plan didn't materialize, her trial did get national headlines and got the attention that she had hoped. On the final day of trial, the judge asked Susan if she had anything she wanted to say, and of course she did, on the women's right to vote. Friends and fellow citizens, I stand before you tonight under indictment for the alleged crime of having voted at the last presidential election without having a lawful right to vote. It shall be my work this evening to prove to you that in thus voting, I not only committed no crime, but instead simply exercised my citizens' rights guaranteed to me and all United States citizens by the national Constitution beyond the power of any state to deny. Our democratic Republican government is based on the idea of the natural right of every individual member thereof to a voice and a vote in making and executing the laws. We assert the province of government to secure the people in the enjoyment of their inalienable right. Her speech goes on to quote the Constitution, which says, "We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our prosperity, do ordain and establish this Constitution for the United States of America. It is we, the people, not we, the white male citizens, nor yet we, the male citizens, but we, the whole people who form the Union. And we formed it not to give the blessings of liberty, but to secure them, not to the half of ourselves and the half of our posterity, but to the whole people, women as well as men. And it is a downright mockery to talk to women of their enjoyment of the blessings of liberty while they are denied the use of the only means of securing them provided by this democratic Republican government, the ballot." And even after the trial, Susan continued her fight for women's suffrage. She didn't give up. She continued lecturing around the country. She created organizations. She wrote in her newspaper, The Revolution. She also found it very important to join forces with Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Matilda Jocelyn Cage to document the women's movement. And they penned the 6-volume book, The History of Women's Suffrage, which she is one of the main contributors for. And Susan even created a press bureau to spread the word in national and local press coverage about the women's suffrage movement. It was in 1905, the year before Susan passed away, that she met with President Theodore Roosevelt trying to find some way to get a women's right to vote amendment in front of Congress. Susan didn't get to see that 19th Amendment pass, which happened almost 15 years after that meeting she had with President Roosevelt, but it still doesn't take away all the work and the foundation that she laid for it to pass. Susan B. Anthony's legacy remains relevant today as her fight for suffrage and equality inspires continued efforts to address gender inequality and systemic injustices. Her work paved the way for the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote. And her dedication for equal rights for all continues to resonate in contemporary social movements. Here's how Susan's legacy continues in today's challenges. 1. Women's suffrage and political representation. While women have the right to vote, disparities in political representation still exist. Susan's fight for suffrage continues to inspire efforts to increase the number of women in government and ensure their voices are heard on policy making. Efforts to suppress the vote, particularly in targeting women and marginalized groups, echo the historical struggles Susan faced. Her legacy reminds us of the importance of protecting and expanding access to voting. Number 2, gender equality and workplace issues. We'll start with equal pay and opportunities. Susan's work laid the groundwork for the fight for equal pay and more opportunities for women in the workplace. Then there's combating discrimination and harassment. Susan's fight for equal rights extends to addressing discrimination and harassment in the workplace and beyond. Her legacy inspires efforts to create safe and equitable environments for all. Number 3, social justice and systemic inequalities. Susan's involvement in the abolition movement and equal rights for all highlights the importance of addressing systemic inequalities in marginalized communities. Susan's legacy inspires ongoing efforts to protect human rights and protect social justice, particularly for women and marginalized groups. And finally, activism and civil engagement, such as empowering women to participate. Susan's activism and powerful speeches continue to inspire women to become active participants in society and continue to advocate for their rights. And promoting education and awareness. Susan's dedication to education and her efforts to raise awareness for women's rights continue to be relevant in today's world. Her legacy encourages us to educate ourselves and others about social justice issues. If Susan B. Anthony's story inspires you too, please continue this conversation and share this episode, talk about it with others, and remember, the ballot is our voice. I'm Ann Potenza, and thank you for listening to Women Who Kick Glass. Please join us next week when we dive into another amazing suffragist, Amelia Bloomer. And until then, keep kicking glass.
Thanks for listening to Women Who Kick Glass. Be sure to follow and subscribe so you never miss an episode. To learn more, contact the show. Visit womenwhokickglass.com. Until next time, keep kicking glass.